Welcome back. Thank you to Pfizer's Demisi Alemiao and ASA's Ronald Wasserstein for their congratulations of Dr. Bickel and also for supporting this colloquium series. Before we invite out Peter and our interviewers, let's check in with the results of our second poll. An overwhelming majority, 44 of 46, responded correctly. The correct answer is D, all three awards. Remember, one lucky question asker will win a commemorative tote bag. Make use of the questions tab on the top left of the main program page. At this time, I'll step backstage to continue to monitor the questions. I invite Peter and the interviewing team of Lisa Levina, Purna Sarkar, and Rachel Wang to join us.
Now that we're all here, we'll start with the interview portion. It's a pleasure to be here and have a chance to chat with Peter. I'll start with introducing myself and get Purna and Rachel to introduce themselves too, explain why we're here. I'm Lisa Levina. I'm professor of statistics at the University of Michigan. I was Peter's PhD student a long time ago at Berkeley, and we've continued collaborating on and off. It's a little bit of our joint work appeared in his talk. Purna?
Hi, everyone. It's very nice to be here. My name is Purna Sarkar. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Statistics and Data Sciences at University of Texas at Austin. And I was one of Peter's postdoctoral scholars at UC Berkeley.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Wang, and it's a great pleasure to be here and have this opportunity to ask Peter some questions. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Sydney, and I was also a PhD student of Peter not so long ago, 5 years ago, 6 years ago now.
All right, so we will be asking some of our own questions, but we will also be taking questions from the audience. So as we go on, feel free to submit your questions and we'll incorporate them into the interview as well. So I'll start, Peter, with a general question. And, part of it came from the audience. The audience question is, could you tell us a little bit about the motivation and the background of the different research areas that you have worked in over the course of your career, which I know is many different areas, so you could pick and choose. And the particular thing that I've always wondered and admired about your work is how you could do both theory and applications and do real theory always, as we know, but also really expand into the applications over time. And if you could tell us how that happened and how you keep this balance between theory and applications going, and if you have any advice for the young generation who is maybe trying to do the same and balance theory and applications.
Thank you, Lisa. It's a pleasure to to be grilled by you and and Purna and Rachel. Well, okay. I actually was interested in biology as well as physical sciences at an early stage. I actually went to high school in Toronto, and at the end of high school, my family moved to Berkeley, and I had to decide whether I would go to the University of Toronto or to Caltech. And I ended up applying to the University of Toronto, to Caltech in physics, and to the University of Toronto in physiology and biochemistry. I couldn't make up my mind then, but in fact, I did go to Caltech and study physics, and then moved to mathematics, and then moved to statistics, and then eventually ended up doing some work in biology. And I think it was very fortunate that I went into mathematics, because I found out when I went to Caltech and took chemistry that all I managed to do was break every test tube in the lab practically. So in any case, so that's how it started. I've always been interested in applying mathematics, if you want, and science to the world. I think, to tell the truth, that my talents lie more in theorizing than in application, but somehow I've managed, often by accident really, to get into applications. I mean, actually, my first applied paper was in science of all places, in the 60s, and it was on sex bias in graduate admissions, and it grew out of actually the work, and the questions came from an anthropologist, Gene Hamill, who was dean of the graduate division at the time, and he asked me a question about a puzzle he found, and I was able to resolve it, even though I really knew hardly any applied statistics at the time, but I didn't know probability theory. And then I think the biology came much later, but there were various excursions. I would say, frankly, that a lot of them were a consequence of accident. So I did some work in climate science, for example, because my daughter lived in Boulder, and I went and worked at NCAR for a while. I actually ended up doing some work in machine learning, computer science with Lisa, because she came to me and asked me whether, you know, she could work on something that she was interested in, and I got interested in it too. So I've wandered around. I think that basically I've found that my talents were mainly in doing mathematics of one sort or another, but I always found it very important to have some sort of motivation, and the closer the motivation was to reality, the better. Though that's, as I think all of you have realized at some point, is not so easy to to bring theory to practice. So that's my long answer, and I can amplify if you want me to do more.
We definitely all know there is a gap. The question is, how big is it?
Yes. I'm sorry, Lisa, I didn't catch that.
No, Rachel, would you like to ask the next question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Lisa. And Peter, if I could just ask you more about your interest in biology and when you started getting involved with, for example, ENCODE, when did you start working on these biological genomic applications?
Oh, thank you, Rachel. Well, it started really with well, there was a combination of things. One is I really wanted to get into genomics. I found it fascinating, just reading as a layperson. And then I acquired an unexpected student, Ben Brown, who actually got his PhD not in statistics, but in applied science and technology, which is in the College of Engineering. And he had rather broad knowledge of biology and worked in laboratories before. And at the same time, I was going to Washington for a period of time, partly for family reasons, and I wanted to work at the NIH. And again, another chance thing, I happened to be on a committee with a man named Maynard Olson. Maynard Olson is a geneticist at the University of Washington, one of the founders really of the Human Genome Project. He was with the Department of Energy at the time. I told him that I was interested in working on learning more about genomics. And he advised me when I was in Washington to get in touch with a student, Eric Green. Eric Green at the time was, I think, if not the director, the assistant director of the National Human Genome Research Institute. He now is the director. And as it turned out, that had just started. There were lots of empty rooms. So I got an office. Ben got an office. And I started to talk to people there. And then I don't exactly remember how I got into the ENCODE project, but through that connection, and with a man named Ewan Burney, who's actually now head of the European Bioscience Institute, again, a biologist, who actually was the leader of the ENCODE project, of the first ENCODE project. And he, with him, actually, my little group became the first, and for a long time, the only statistics group associated with ENCODE. And so then we had to get serious, and luckily we were able to help.
Thank you, Peter. And that's certainly a lot of interesting connections there.
Yeah. Just chance, largely.
That's awesome. So, Puna, did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, since we are all, talking about different research directions, and I was I was wondering how you got interested in networks.
Well, that's another strange connection. And in fact, my major interest in networks started through a contract, actually, with the National Security Agency, which I inherited from, well, no, actually, at Berkeley, I started it. It had been at Stanford for a while, and we started in Berkeley long, long ago in the 90s. And it is to do to solve unclassified problems from the National Security Agency, which means no data, but little stories which resemble problems that they have. Not surprisingly, there were quite a few stories about networks, because this was after 9/11, and there was great interest in detecting networks of conspirators, I believe. And they came up many times with problems which foreshadowed big questions in statistics. I mean, machine learning issues came up very, very early, and networks came up early. Herman Chernoff once told me, because this thing predated Berkeley's involvement, at Stanford, Herman claimed that design of experiments, sequential design of experiments, came out of NSA problems. And they permitted publication. So that was part of the condition, that it was all completely free. And so that's how it started.
That is really interesting. Lisa?
I'll go next. Yeah, I have a general question, which also arose out of the biological and network applications, but I think it happens in other areas as well. But certainly networks, which I know firsthand about, it's often hard to know what ground truth is. For communities and also for other things. In biology, that's also often an issue. So if we don't have access to gold standard ground truth, what do you think are the best practices and the best validation strategies for statisticians?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and one, of course, we all have thought about at various times. And I think, and that's actually a virtue of statistics, that one has to work closely with, if it's in science, with people in the domain. And the validation, the real validation comes, I mean, ideally it would come from prediction, but that happens very rarely. I mean, perfect prediction. You can predict something, and then an experiment can be run, and in genomics, often the experiment is not necessarily conclusive, as a matter of fact. But there's always evidence of different types on that question in the literature from different data. And anything that you can get from there, coming through an educated source, namely a collaborator who really knows the area, is the best way of validating, as far as I'm concerned.
That sounds like if you can do that, that has to be a good way out.
Right. It's not necessarily very easy, as we know.
Absolutely.
I mean, part of it is, of course, something that I guess I would like to mention, because it's really important, I think, for students at all levels, is that in doing that, one has to learn the language of the scientist that one is collaborating with, because otherwise one ends up with you know, finding nice mathematical things which are irrelevant, and not answering their questions. I mean, there's a famous joke. I probably shouldn't go into this, but there's a famous joke, you know, of the mathematician who rushes into the office of the scientist, waving, saying that I have the solution to all your problems. And that's on the one hand. And the other joke direction is that the biologist rushes into the office of the mathematician and says, "Just give me an algorithm, and I'll go away." So,
yeah. No, I think you're absolutely allowed jokes, Peter. I don't think that's against the rules. Let me ask a question from the audience that came in, which is more on the mathematical side. So there were two areas of you could say, pure math that at least make an appearance in your talk, which is topology and graph theory.
Yes.
And how deeply into these areas of math did you need to go? What were the most useful ideas borrowed from those areas?
Okay. I think actually the main area of mathematics, I think throughout my work, which has played a role, is probability theory. And yes, I know topology. I learned it as a graduate student. I've had occasion to use it, but it's not been that central an area. Functional analysis has proved much more important, actually, if one starts to think of areas of mathematics. And graph theory, yes, I learned sort of bits and pieces as I went along. So, for example, I came at actually starting my theoretical work in graph theory from some ideas due to David Aldous, who was a colleague of mine, but in the end discovered that in fact those ideas were from a completely different direction, coming from Lovash and people at Microsoft theory. So I learned a bit of graph theory that way, but neither of those has been central to my work. I mean, not that they're not important. Okay.
Rachel?
Yes, Peter, I would like to follow up on the question that Lisa was asking about ground truth. It's also a question about how to deal with real data. So the large amounts of biological data being generated at the moment are a blessing, but also a curse, because we can have, for example, batch effects, variability in experimental conditions, etc. In what ways can we take advantage of these large amounts of data without sacrificing reproducibility? And what best practice should statisticians follow when working with scientists? Actually, you've answered that part of the question already in your previous.
Well, that's a very difficult question, of course, because the assumption of homogeneity is in some sense often one that has to be established as one goes along. But essentially, I guess the most reliable approach is, again, a fairly standard one, which is sample splitting and cross-validation. That is, you assume that things are homogeneous. You do your exploratory analysis in one part of the data, and then you try to see how well it performs in parts of the data that you haven't yet touched. The dangers, of course, of touching both times and possibly quite getting fooled, but that's unfortunately something one always has to guard against. It's the same principle as is used in machine learning between the training sample and the test sample, and it's about the only thing that we have, other than, again, as we've discussed, other data, knowledge from other realms that can be brought in.
Yeah, now that you mentioned machine learning, I actually have a question from the audience on robust statistics. So you worked on robust statistics in the 1970s and 80s, and robustness is coming back. Is a very hot topic in machine learning at the moment. Could you tell us how you started working on robustness, and what do you think the robustness study in machine learning, in what way it can help?
Interesting. This is something that I don't only know marginally. However, I'm aware of one big distinction. From the very beginning, robustness in statistics dealt with sort of two realms. One was small perturbations, robustness against small perturbations, and the other one was robustness against large perturbations. And the small perturbations ideas really came from Peter Huber fairly early on in the mid-60s, shortly after I got my thesis, in fact. And the large deviation robustness ideas came from Frank Hampel. Hampel was actually a student of Eric Lehmann's, of whom I was also a student. And I think the emphasis, my impression is that the emphasis in machine learning is very much on the second. That is, things like breakdown point and guarantees of against perturbations. I have to admit that of course I've always worked on the other side, so so my prejudices are on small deviations where you can actually calculate things and get an idea of what's happening in a more precise fashion. I've always been a little bit worried about the guarantees and the large deviation bounds. I'll be a bit heretical here, because they involve always constants, which are so large that the bounds are themselves not too worthwhile. And in fact, this has been an old controversy, even in statistics, right? I mean, on the one hand, you have the central limit theorem, which doesn't tell you anything about, gives you no guarantees, but simply tells you about an approximation. And on the other hand, you have the Berriosine theorem, which gives you, guarantees which are by now been done in the best possible way. And the trouble is that the guarantees are always worst case guarantees, necessarily. And fortunately, I think, people find that most of the time, the world, the world is more like what Einstein said, that it's God is subtle, but not malicious. And in fact, it's interesting. I mean, I was just talking, there's a paper which recently came out, by a very nice paper by Mike, Ali Hualei and Mike Jordan, and a student of Stephen Baker, I believe, which basically did both things, studied both sort of limiting things and bounds. And when they got to a serious problem, the bounds were useless and what didn't tell them anything, but the limiting approximations did. So that's an anecdote.
Thank you, Peter. If I could sort of jump back and forth a little bit and come back to the data perspective for genomics and ask a question about limitations of genomics. What do you think are the current limitations on what we can learn from genomics data from a statistical point of view and a biological point of view?
Well, I think the main, I'm not sure I'm going to answer your question directly. The main lesson that I thought came from the ENCODE project, whose original goal was in fact, through genomics, if you want, to annotate biologically every element of the human genome. And from that point of view, the project, I think everybody agrees, was a failure. But what it did do is it biochemically annotated a lot of elements of the human genome, most of the human genome, and it basically, as far as I was concerned, pointed to the fact that things are much, much more complex than we ever thought they were. So the fact that the human genome is, sort of written in this long strip of ACGTs, by now we know that, in fact, of course, the strip is bound up into spirals, as we noted in one of the papers that we discussed. The fact that there are these so-called epigenetic effects, right? They're things that the mother passes on to the embryo, which don't have anything to do with the original, with the genome, embryo's own genome, and so everything is just extremely complicated. And I think one has to try and use whatever methods one can, combining statistical methods and experimental methods, and the data has to be generated largely experimentally, though not necessarily. You can generate data from data, right, as we know. And in fact, that again was a subject of one of the problems in the last paper. But yeah, I mean, I think everybody is still seeking from some large organizing principles. And there are organizing principles, but certainly not enough for us to have a clear idea of the whole.
It's definitely a very complex world we're dealing with in biology. So I've taken up a lot of time, and I will hand it over to Puna.
Let me just interject with an audience question
Oh, yeah.
briefly, so we're not forgetting the audience, and I'll hand it over to Purna. Slightly more technical question about how do you choose the optimal block size? Now, it is indeed a theme that came up and M out of and Bootstrap in your work in the 80s was part of my thesis for texture synthesis.
Right.
Now we have to think about it for network Bootstrap as well. All these things.
I'm afraid that the only thing that I can think, I mean, again, it's sample splitting, right? I mean, it's cross validation. You try and after all, it's fitting more parameters. Block size is just another. They're tuning parameters to your methods, whatever they are. And we found that to get at tuning parameters, you need to try and go outside of on the whole, to try to not fit on the same data that you are going to use the method on. I mean, as usual with cross-validation, you keep on doing both, but somehow the idea is to try to separate the two.
So, Courtney, you want to take a turn?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Lisa. So I want to first ask you one audience question, which I believe is about the TAD detection with network models part. And the question is, you got really nice biological results from community detection, but how will one do uncertainty quantification for one given node?
Well,
Hard one.
Yeah, that's a real hard question.
This came from Dinching Fan, just so you know. Thank you for that, Dinching.
I mean, there are asymptotic approximations that one can get, I think, to the distribution of the estimates of the parameters that we had, and so we can do the usual sort of game. I would guess that there too, in the end, we can try to use bootstrap methods or resampling methods, but I have to admit we did not think sharply about those questions, unless I forgot. Rachel, can you? I mean, did we?
Rachel? Sorry, my internet was a bit spotty.
Oh, I'm sorry. The question was about inferential measures on the work that we did with TADs. And Purna too, I suppose. I don't know why. but so the question is thrown back to both of you.
So inferential measures we use to evaluate the quality of the tags we tested.
Yes.
Yeah, so there's this the boundary test, I guess Peter mentioned in your talk, which is looking at the number of histone modification peaks at the boundaries. So that's sort of like from a biological point of view in computational validation. So around biologically around the endpoints of these tags, you would expect to see more histone modification or enrichment of these peaks. So that's one of the things we looked at. And for the conserved TAD across different cell lines, we looked at how these histone tracks are correlated across different cell lines. So if you see high correlation, then that's a good indication that these tags are acting as a coordinated unit. So that's another inferential, but it's not, again, it's not golden standard, but something that that can help us see what we found makes sense.
But we did not, I guess we didn't really do formal analyses on variability of the parameters,
Yeah, we looked at a little bit the robustness of the parameters.
Yes, but not the, yes, we did, but. So that's, that's not such a complete answer, but
Hopefully that,
more.
yeah.
So let me ask you another question about kind of, like networks. And this is again related to the questions that Lisa asked and Rachel asked about ground truth validation and so on. So, community detection has been around and has been studied in statistics. But there is also a point of view which stems from kind of studying very large social networks, that models which lead to a few very large clusters are not really very realistic. And I was wondering, how do you feel that, the hierarchical clustering work that you talked about, that kind of perhaps gives some partial answers to this kind of like dilemma or concern?
Yes, I do, because one can think quite plausibly of hierarchical structures arising in the world. I mean, not just in evolutionary trees, but also in organizations of executives and things of this kind. But it's clearly only part of the story, and I think the thing that's hinted at to some extent in the question, I think, is heterogeneity, and the fact that in graphs, in these very large graphs, one has all sorts of structures, and one has communities, but also has hubs. One has hierarchical community structures, but again, perhaps links between hierarchies. There's no reason why not. One can have forests of trees rather than a single tree, for example. And I think it's right that that may be a reasonable next step to go in modeling graphs, is to start to think of models which permit, which one could try and analyze, but which permit these different kinds of phenomena in different parts of the graph, and also permit, as I think is actually the case in many, is to have lots of isolated nodes which give one no information, but which one can condition on, just saying that. So you end up with a model which is not of the usual type. That is, it isn't that once you've done all this conditioning and so on, you're certainly not necessarily having the basic assumption that given the hidden variables, edges are independent of each other. But nevertheless, one can, I think, formulate models which might really fit larger structures.
So let me ask another question. So this is not really about networks so much, but it's kind of about future directions, because we have at least 2 questions from the audience and we wanted to ask it too. So, like broadly speaking, I think the question is, where do you see statistics, machine learning kind of moving to? What are the open problems that you would be interested in solving, or like young researchers who are coming in should look into?
Yeah, well, I'm too old to try to really think of solving any. But I do think I think dealing with heterogeneity is one, as we discussed. Another is one which I think has been percolating around the machine learning community and is now also becoming prevalent in the statistics community, which is somehow trying to understand deep learning, these phenomena that, in some sense, you run algorithms past the point where you have perfect fitting on the training data, and yet you end up doing better. You can still do better on the test data. There's been a lot of analysis of that from different angles. I'm not sure that any of it actually has been conclusive. On a larger scale, I mean, I'm being very vague because, as I said, I know that I won't be able to work on these, but is the whole interweaving of the question of sparsity and deep learning, Because deep learning appears to say, well, you know, the more data, the better, and in fact, you need to have huge amounts of data. And yet, somehow, for understanding, we think we need sparsity. Actually, at one point, I would have said that clearly, but I've gotten quite not so sure of myself anymore. Because if one starts to think about science, right, at any given stage, there may be sparsity, right? To understand part of the phenomenon, we can't think of too many things. But when you think of the structure as a whole, to which you apply, when predictions are applied, you actually have enormously complex structures, which have been built out of these small pieces. And so somehow the question is, how do you relate the sparse to the complex? I think it's some vague way related to these models where you have self-assembling complexity, things like the Conway things, where you get all sorts of strange patterns formed out of very, very simple rules. So that's, so I mean, those are large questions, but I think they're interesting, and then I guess the third thing, which I guess I have always, I'm repeating myself here, is that one really, if one was going to work and advance science as a whole, not just mathematics or machine learning, or one has to work closely with scientists. And I think in a way that's where statisticians are perhaps best equipped. We have a tradition of doing that, which is less present, I think, let's say, for instance, in the computer science on the whole.
Peter, to follow up on that distinction between now what Leo Breiman, who I know you were close with, called the two cultures. Back then, the machine learning culture of predicting things doesn't matter how, and the more modeling, scientific modeling culture that comes from traditional statistics. One question from Jen Ching again is, in so many applications, in so many settings that you're in, how do you know, how can you tell that some setting will be a good candidate for scientific modeling? When you consider the vast array of things you could be doing.
Again, those questions tend to be very difficult to answer. I mean, you know, you can ask why did Einstein focus on trying to understand the speed of light? I mean, that was a very fruitful question, right? I mean, to some extent, obviously, you have to look, well, you have to follow your impulses and follow what you've learned, and take chances.
Yes, take risks, right?
Take risks, exactly.
So in this prediction versus modeling culture, that's something that machine learning has been criticized for, and they're aware of that now, and there's been a push for interpretable machine learning, right, where they use other ways to interpret variables. Do you think that effort has bridged the gap? Do you think that's been successful?
Not for me, but on the other hand, I just haven't kept up with everything. I mean, I know that there is that effort, but I think somehow in some sense these are sort of, this all bears, I don't know specifically on the various things that have been going on in the machine learning community, but I do feel that the issue as a whole is to some extent a philosophical issue, right? How do you put together, you know, interpretability with prediction? You always have to be able in the end to predict something new, because otherwise you're telling yourself a story, but there's no guarantee that the story, you know, is outside of your mind. I mean, that was actually the big leap from the Greeks to you know, to the present in some sense. And so yeah, I think it's I don't think I have a very good answer.
Here's a question from another former student of yours, Wang. Can you tell us some stories from when you were writing your two famous books, the textbook with Sheldoxum and the semi-parametric book?
Ah. Well, the textbook grew out of having to teach a course, of course, as usual. And in fact, there are really two books, although people may not be aware of it. The first edition of the textbook and the second edition are quite different, and really because they were designed for different courses. The first one was designed sort of for a general course for graduate students, not necessarily statistics or in mathematics, and the second one was very definitely aimed at the latter. And so that was the basis of them. But as usual, the real thing that drove it was to try to understand what one was teaching. And I had, for example, learned statistics, since you've asked about stories, I had learned statistics from Eric Lehman's books, right? Testing statistical hypotheses and the estimation book. And I found them very elegant and I liked them, but I found it very unnatural. The two topics were separated. And somehow the link to applications was really not apparent. Not that I tried to do that in my books a little bit, to the extent I could, to try to relate the theory to the application. The semi-parametrics book grew out of quite differently. I got interested in first of all, in adaptation, not in the current sense, but in the sense of adapting within the context of semi-parametric models, if you want, and then realized that this was a much broader thing. And the strong influences from Lucien Lecam and from work of Ibrahimov and Kazminski, and actually German statistician Johann Fansagel, and others. And so I began working on those. I gave a series of lectures. I was asked to do a series of lectures at Johns Hopkins, and then realized that two strains of work actually were dealing with the same thing. And in fact, the common link was an idea that already appeared in robustness, namely the influence function. So there was work on sort of efficient score functions, and there was work on adaptation, and it all could be linked, and that was started to write the book. And of course, I didn't get very far, but fortunately, it was at that point that Yanki Ritov was my student in Israel, and he began to produce genuine solutions to things, and we started to work together. So that was the development.
So I think we have time for perhaps one more question, or maybe two if we do them quickly. But I have one question I wanted to ask, which I think is relevant to both young people, PhD students, and young researchers, and also to more senior people like me who have to worry about how to train those students. So, the landscape has changed very much since you were a graduate student, since I was a graduate student, for sure. And the students need more skills in computing than ever, and they need to know new things. And it's a different field now. And one cannot do everything. And there may be some things that we used to teach them that we no longer need to or no longer have the time to. So what is your view on how the training of the next generation should look in this day and age?
Well, I haven't been involved in training the next generation for a while, except perhaps at the graduate student level. But I do think that some things have to continue, and that is probability theory at some level, because that is the distinguishing feature of statistics, and I think it's also become really one of the key ideas in the modern world. I mean, ever since quantum theory was developed, that probability is not simply a device for analyzing things, that it's really something, an intrinsic part, probability theory as such, of the world, and also statistical thinking is a key. So at some point, I think one has to learn how to do statistical thinking in the context of data, you know, at the type of courses like, I think some of you may know, like Data 8 and Data 100 and so on, that were developed at Berkeley. On the other hand, I think one needs still things like matrix analysis. I think actually even functional analysis, maybe more discrete mathematics. But in the end, I think, apart from these sort of, in some sense, basic things, most of which I guess can even be gotten initially at the undergraduate level, I think what one has to have is sort of individually tailored courses. That people, if they, in particular, if they're interested in applications of any sort, that they have to have a strong background in the area that they intend to do their applications in. And that has to be combined with, to the extent one can, background in mathematics and computing, of course. I mean, computing is, again, absolutely essential.
Makes sense. Well, I think I can still ask one more question from the audience, which we decided not to ask that, but it's coming from the audience, so we'll ask it anyway. How do you see statistics in the age of data science? And you know, more specifically, if say you have a journal of applied statistics, which you know wants to become a journal of data science, how should it update itself? What would take a journal in applied statistics and make it a data science journal?
Well, I think having, for example, actual analyses of algorithms I view that as part of data science. Having papers on databases and on structure of data, because after all, statistics is bound by the way that the data is, to some extent, the data is presented initially, and it's not an accidental aspect of the data. So much more breadth, and papers on which I think are present to some extent on applications, but which they can't really be devoted in particular to the application, because that should be appearing in the application journal, right? But that the application should be treated seriously, right? So that the subtleties appear, that the data not be simply an example for the application of a statistical method, which is, I'm afraid, often the case both in applied and theoretical statistical journals.
Very true. All right, I think that's all we had time for. Thank you very much, Peter. It was a joy to talk, as always. I think at this point, Purna, Rachel, and myself will leave, and you stay on for final remarks. And thank you also to the audience, though we can't see you, but they're definitely friends in the audience, and thank you for asking many great questions.
If I may, can I also thank you?
Yes, thank you,
Thank
Peter.
my questioners, and thank the audience too. I'll have more opportunity to do that, but this was indeed a great pleasure, and thank you for all the questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
So now Haim will rejoin us for the closing remarks. And Peter will remain, and it is time for us interviewers to head backstage.
Thank you to our interviewers and audience for your thoughtful questions. I would like now to recognize the organizing committee, my colleagues Deepak Day, Yuping Zhang, Yao Zheng, administrative staff Tracy Burke, Anthony Lewis, and Juliet Kapsis for their dedication in seeing this colloquium come to fruition. Also, thanks to our dedicated steering committee members, Kana Natarajan, Debussy Alemiao, Dan Mayer, Ron Wasserstein, Nancy Flournoy, Deepak Day, Joseph Glass, and Ming-Wei Chen. Peter, on behalf of our sponsors and our guests, we'd like to thank you for such inspirational remarks. To honor your participation in this event, we have presented you with a plaque in recognition of your exceptional contributions to our field. If you would like to show it to...
I'm glad to show the plaque to all in some degree. Thank you very much for the plaque, and of course for the invitation. Well, let me say more about word of thanks, if I may. Is that time for me to do so?
That is the time, yes.
Okay, so well, I would like to thank Again, I would like to thank the questioners for their thoughtful remarks. I want to thank Demissier, Ron Wasserstein, Deepak, you, Naiti Ting, and in general, the selection committee for inviting me to this very interesting occasion. This is certainly my first video presentation of this type, and it's an honor to be selected as the speaker. I would like also to thank, not least, Juliet and her staff for the enormous attention they paid throughout this process and their help. And well, I hope I haven't left anybody out. I believe I've mentioned you. Thank you for all your remarks, and it's been an interesting and pleasant occasion, and I hope the audience enjoyed it too.
I'm sure they did. Thank you again, Peter. As a reminder, the recording of today's program will be available in approximately 24 hours. We will send you an email with viewing instructions. Thanks again to our sponsors, Pfizer, ASA, and UConn for making this event possible. Thank you all for attending and hope to see you next time. Be well.
Thanks.